June 7th, 1944, 6:30 in the morning. Normandy, France. A small village on the edge of a river. A bridge. 2 days earlier, a British sapper had blown that bridge up. The explosion had split the night in two. Timber and iron had scattered into the river below. The approach route had been cut. Now that same sapper was standing at the edge of that same river. And the bridge was standing. The Germans had worked through the night. Their engineers had moved fast. They always did. Timber beams brought in, steel supports fitted, the structure reinforced at the points that had survived the first blast. The bridge wasn't perfect, but it was functional. German vehicles could cross. German reinforcements could move. The sapper looked at his pack. He had brought more explosives, a second set. He'd carried them on the first trip specifically for this possibility. He looked at the bridge. He looked at the pack. He opened the pack. Subscribe right now, because this story isn't just about blowing up the same bridge twice. It's about the fact that this man planned for the second trip before the first one started. He brought the extra charges. He left specific structural points untouched the first time. The ones he knew the German engineers would reinforce, so he could target the points they'd leave alone the second time. That kind of thinking, in the middle of a war, in the dark, under fire, is what this story is about. June 6, 1944. D-Day. 156,000 Allied troops went ashore on 5 beaches in Normandy. The largest seaborne invasion in human history. The operation that had been planned, rehearsed, argued over, and postponed for years, finally happening. But getting onto the beach was only the beginning. The forces that landed on those beaches had to push inland, and the roads that led inland ran across rivers and canals. Normandy's interior was laced with waterways. The Orne, the Dives, a dozen smaller rivers and streams, all crossed by bridges of varying sizes and conditions. Some of those bridges were old stone, some were timber and iron, thrown up in the 19th century. Some had been reinforced during the German occupation. All of them were, in the strategic language of June 1944, critical points. Both sides understood this with complete clarity. For the German command, the bridges were lifelines. Kesselring's forces in Normandy needed to receive reinforcements. The armored divisions sitting inland needed to get to the coast before the Allied beachhead consolidated. The supply lines needed to keep moving. None of that happened without the bridges. For the Allies, the logic ran in exactly the opposite direction. Specific bridges destroyed at specific times could delay German armored reinforcements by hours, could force rerouting that cost even more hours. In the first days of a beach landing, when the Allied position was still vulnerable, every hour of delay mattered enormously. The men whose job it was to go out and destroy those bridges were called sappers, Royal Engineers, and among them, on June 5th and 6th, 1944, was a 24-year-old from Yorkshire named Thomas Briggs, Thomas William Briggs. Born in Yorkshire, 1920. His dad worked in the mines. His mother stayed home and raised 4 kids in a 2-up, 2-down terrace house in a northern English town where everyone on the street had the same job and the same worries and the same quiet toughness about it. Briggs left school and went into construction. Not glamorous work. Concrete pouring, steel fixing, foundation digging, scaffolding. The kind of work where you learn things with your hands that nobody teaches in a classroom. How a structure carries weight, where the load concentrates, which point holds everything together, and which points are just filling in the gaps. He was good at it. More than good, he was systematic about it in a way that most laborers his age weren't. He didn't just do the job, he thought about the job. Why does this work? What happens if that fails? Where's the weakest point in this structure? When the war started and he joined the Royal Engineers, those questions took on a different meaning, because the answer to where's the weakest point in this structure was now, professionally, the answer to where do I put the explosive. Briggs took to demolition training the way some people take to something they've been doing their whole lives without realizing it. Structural analysis, minimal charge placement, achieving maximum effect with minimum material. The physics of a controlled collapse. His instructors noted something specific in his assessments. He consistently asked questions that most trainees didn't think to ask. Not, how do I blow this bridge up, but how do I blow this bridge up in a way that makes it hardest to repair quickly? That question, how do you make the damage hardest to repair, is what made Briggs different. And it's what explains everything that happened in Normandy, June 5, 1944. Night, hours before D-Day. Briggs and a small team, 4 men, went ashore quietly on the Normandy coast. No guns firing yet, no beach assault, just darkness, and the sound of the water, and the weight of what they knew was coming in a few hours. The mission was clear. Reach a specific bridge over a small river in the Norman interior. Destroy it. Return. They moved through the night carefully. German patrol routes had been mapped during reconnaissance. Timings were known. The team moved in the gaps. They reached the bridge. Briggs studied it the way he always studied a structure before touching it. Not just, where do I put the charge to make it fall down, but a full structural assessment. Which elements are load-bearing? Which are redundant? What's the minimum damage that renders this bridge impassable to military vehicles? And, critically, which points, if he hit them, would be easiest for German engineers to repair, and which would be hardest? He placed the charges with specific intention. He targeted the points that would produce maximum collapse with minimum explosive use, but he deliberately left certain structural elements untouched. The elements he assessed as the ones German engineers would prioritize reinforcing if they got to work on this overnight. Why leave anything untouched? Because he had a second set of charges in his pack, and he was already thinking about the second trip. The team withdrew. The charges went. The bridge came down. Mission complete. Briggs looked back once as they moved away, noted the collapse pattern, noted what was still standing, filed it away. The German engineers got to work immediately. Kesselring's forces in Normandy had standing orders for exactly this scenario. Bridge sabotage was an expected Allied tactic, and the response was pre-planned. Assessment teams, repair materials pre-positioned, priority routes identified. The bridge Briggs had hit wasn't a total loss. The main span had collapsed, but the supporting structure on both banks had survived, partly because of the specific way the charges had been placed. German engineers assessed the damage with professional speed. Timber beams were brought forward. Steel supports were fitted. By early morning of June 7th, the bridge was functional. Not perfect, not a full rebuild, but passable for military vehicles. The German sector report filed that morning noted, bridge repaired, light to medium vehicle traffic restored. This is exactly what Briggs had predicted. A complete bridge demolition, one that leaves nothing repairable, requires either a very large quantity of explosive, a lot of time, or both. In a night operation, moving fast through enemy territory with a limited load, achieving total irreparable destruction is extremely difficult. German military engineers were good. They were fast. They were systematic. What Briggs had done was different from simply trying to destroy the bridge as thoroughly as possible. He had thought about the repair process. He had left the elements that German engineers would rebuild first, knowing that in rebuilding those elements, they'd leave the others relatively unchanged. And those unchanged elements were exactly where his second set of charges was going. June 7th, 1944. Early morning, Briggs walked into his commanding officer's position and gave a brief report. The bridge had been repaired. He had personally confirmed this through observation, and he had a second set of charges still in his kit. His CO looked at him. 36 hours had passed since D-Day. The beachhead was holding but barely. German counterattacks were probing the Allied line at multiple points. Every available man was committed somewhere, and this sapper was proposing to go back through enemy lines, alone this time, to keep the footprint small, to a bridge that the Germans now knew had been targeted once and would almost certainly be watching. The risk was obvious, but so was the alternative. An open bridge on that route meant German armor could move. German reinforcements could reach the coast. The 3 days that a complete demolition would buy, 3 days that Briggs's second set of charges could deliver, were not an abstraction. They were the difference between the Allied beachhead consolidating or being hit by a counterattack it wasn't ready for. The CO thought about it for less than a minute. Go, be careful. Briggs went back out. The second trip was harder in every way. The Germans had increased patrol frequency around the bridge after the first destruction. 2 separate security elements were covering the approach routes, 1 moving patrol, 1 static position. The engineering unit that had done the repair was still in the area, which meant additional personnel with knowledge of the local ground. Briggs moved alone. Smaller target, less noise. He found a position in a drainage ditch with a line of sight to the bridge and spent hours watching. Patrol schedules, guard rotations, the gap between the moving patrol's furthest point and its return. The static position's coverage arc. There was a window, about 7 minutes, between the end of one patrol and the beginning of the next guard rotation. 7 minutes to get to the bridge, place the charges, and get back to a safe distance. He had pre-identified the target points during the first operation. The structural elements that would be left relatively unchanged after the German repair. Looking at the bridge now, repaired and standing, he confirmed his assessment. The Germans had done exactly what he'd expected. They'd reinforced the primary load-bearing elements at the main span. The secondary supports on the eastern foundation approach, the ones he'd left alone on the first trip, were still in their original condition. The window opened. He moved, reached the bridge, placed the charges at the pre-identified points. Fast, no hesitation. He'd run through this in his head hundreds of times during the observation wait. Withdrew to safe distance. The charges went. This time the bridge came down properly. Foundation approach on the eastern side taken out. Primary span unsupported. Structural collapse total. The German sector report filed later that day. Bridge destroyed. Complete reconstruction required. Estimated timeline, 72 hours minimum. 72 hours, 3 days. Let me stop here for a second, because what Briggs did is technically impressive. Yes, 2 demolition operations on the same bridge, each precisely calculated, the second one designed around the predictable response to the first. But here's the thing that I keep coming back to. He brought the second set of charges on the first trip. Before the first mission started, before he'd seen the bridge, before he knew whether the first demolition would be total or partial, before he had any confirmation of what the Germans would do overnight. He had already packed a second set of charges and planned the possibility of a second trip. That's not bravery in the conventional sense. That's a specific kind of thinking. The thinking that asks, what happens after this works? What's the most likely response? And how do I account for that response before it happens? In war, that thinking is rare. Most people under that kind of pressure are focused entirely on the current objective, getting through the current mission. Briggs was thinking one move ahead while the current move was still being made. Let me ask you something. Do you think that's a natural trait or something learned? Because I genuinely don't know. Drop it in the comments. And if this kind of story is what you came here for, subscribe right now. Every day on this channel, I find the stories that stayed buried in regimental records and after-action reports. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and tell me where in the world you're watching from. I read every comment. Let's go to the German side for a moment. After the second demolition, the German engineering officer responsible for that sector faced a problem that went beyond the bridge itself. The same bridge, twice, in under 48 hours. That alone was notable, but the second demolition had a specific characteristic that made it more than just a repeated attack. The first demolition had targeted the primary structural load points, the obvious choice, the textbook approach. The second demolition had targeted entirely different points, not the reinforced areas, the secondary foundation elements that the repair team had left in original condition. For a German engineer looking at the wreckage of the second collapse, the implication was uncomfortable. The British sapper, it was almost certainly one man, based on the operational signature, had assessed what the repair would look like before executing the first demolition. He had known which points would be repaired and which would be left alone, and he had calibrated the first demolition to create the conditions for the second one. That's not standard demolitions work. That's an entirely different kind of thinking. The German after-action assessment for that sector recorded, "Second sabotage demonstrates detailed structural knowledge of the bridge and advanced consideration of repair methodology." The operative appears to have planned both demolitions as a coordinated sequence rather than as independent actions. Complete reconstruction required, minimum 72 hours. The officer who filed that report later added a handwritten note in the margin. Discovered when the documents were recovered after the war. Whoever planned this understood the bridge better than we did. After the second demolition, Briggs was trying to get back. The situation had changed significantly. 2 demolitions on the same bridge in less than 48 hours had triggered a systematic response from German security forces in the area. Patrol routes were doubled. Exit points were being covered. Every barn, farmhouse, and outbuilding in the sector was being checked. Briggs moved at night and hid during daylight. He'd done this before in training. The principle was simple. If you can't be seen, you can't be caught. Day 2, he found cover in the outbuildings of a French farmstead. The family, a husband, wife, and their teenage son, saw him, understood immediately what he was, and said nothing. They brought him water and bread after dark. They didn't ask questions. He didn't give them any answers. He was there for 3 days. On the 4th day, a German patrol conducted a systematic search of every structure on the road, door by door, building by building. They found him. He had no explosives, no weapon, just his British Army uniform. The German sergeant looked at him for a long moment, then at the French family, then back at Briggs. "Sapper," he said. One word. Briggs said nothing. The interrogation lasted 3 hours, possibly longer. The German intelligence officer who conducted it had one core question, which he approached from multiple angles over the course of the session. How did you do it? How did you plan the second demolition around the first? Who provided support? What route did you use? Who were the French civilians who helped you? Briggs gave his name, his rank, his service number. Nothing else. The officer changed approach, pointed out that cooperation would affect his treatment as a prisoner, that the information he was withholding was operational detail that would become irrelevant within days as the front moved, that the French family had been identified and their situation was precarious. Briggs said nothing. The officer leaned across the table. "You blew the bridge twice. I already know that. I'm asking how you planned it." Briggs looked at him, didn't answer. "The structural analysis, that was your work? You left specific points untouched on the first demolition?" Silence. The officer closed the file. Briggs was processed as a prisoner of war and transferred to a holding facility. The French family, and as far as the available records indicate, was questioned, but not further detained. Briggs had given nothing. I want to stay on that interrogation room for a moment, because Briggs's silence in that room mattered as much as anything he did at the bridge. Think about what was being asked, not just operational details about the demolition. The questions about who helped him, what routes he used, who the French family was, those weren't abstract. The French family was still in their farmhouse. The resistance networks in that sector were still operating. The escape routes that Allied personnel used to move through occupied Normandy were still being used. One name, one route detail, one piece of information that could have connected something Briggs knew to something the German officer didn't. That could have put people in danger. Briggs knew all of this. He was an intelligent man. He understood exactly what the questions were for, and he said nothing. For 3 hours, under pressure that most people who haven't been in that situation can't accurately imagine. We talk about battlefield courage all the time. Running toward fire, holding a position, going back behind enemy lines a second time. This is different. This is the courage of staying completely quiet when talking would make things easier for you and harder for everyone else. What do you think? Is that harder or easier than physical courage? Seriously, drop it in the comments. And if you're not subscribed, do it now. Hit the bell. We're not done with this story. Briggs was transferred to a prisoner of war camp, first in northern France, then as the front shifted, into Germany itself. The conditions were what they were: cold in winter, food always short. The specific grinding monotony of captivity that men who've been through it describe as its own kind of warfare. Against boredom, against despair, against the loss of any sense that you're doing anything useful. Briggs fought that the way he fought everything else. He studied the camp, the way he studied a bridge, systematically. Guard rotations, patrol schedules, the physical layout, weak points in the perimeter, which guards were attentive and which were not. He made 2 escape attempts. The first got him outside the wire and 3 miles down the road before a patrol caught him. 14 days in solitary. The second was more sophisticated. He'd worked out a route through a maintenance area that the perimeter lighting didn't adequately cover. He got 6 miles, caught at a roadblock that wasn't on any map he'd been able to construct from observation. 14 more days in solitary. He started working on a third plan. In April 1945, he didn't need it. American forces liberated the camp. The gates opened. The guards were gone. Briggs walked out and looked around at the German countryside for a long moment. Then he asked the nearest American officer for transport to Normandy. The American officer looked at him the way people sometimes look at someone who has said something completely unexpected. Normandy. Why Normandy? The war was over, or close enough. Why not England? Why not home? Briggs explained it the way he explained most things, briefly and directly. There was a bridge he'd blown up twice. He wanted to see what state it was in. The officer considered this for a moment. He had a vehicle making a supply run west anyway. "I can get you close," he said. It took 2 days to reach the area. The Normandy countryside in April 1945 was already beginning to look like itself again. Farms working, roads clear, the wreckage of the previous June being slowly absorbed back into the landscape. Briggs walked the last stretch to the river. He stood on the bank and looked at the bridge. It was standing, properly standing. The Germans had done a third repair during the campaign. A rough job, necessary for military use. After the war ended, French engineers had come through and rebuilt it correctly. Concrete foundations, proper steel work, a bridge built to last. Briggs studied it for a while. An old Frenchman from the village came down to the riverbank, probably curious about this foreign soldier standing alone looking at the water. He said something in French that Briggs didn't understand. Briggs looked at him, then looked back at the bridge, and laughed. Not loudly, just a quiet, private laugh. The old man laughed too, though neither of them could have fully explained why. Briggs got back to England in May 1945. Back to Yorkshire. Back to his family. He came home with a military medal, awarded for the 2 demolition operations in Normandy and for his conduct during the interrogation that followed his capture. The citation was precise in the way military citations tend to be: factual, understated, entirely missing the texture of what had actually happened. At the medal ceremony, his commanding officer said something that the few people who recorded that day consistently reported as the clearest summary of what Briggs had done. The technical execution of both demolitions was impressive, but the planning was more impressive. Briggs went to that bridge the first time already thinking about the second time. That kind of forward thinking, in the field under those conditions, is rare. It's the kind of thinking that wins small engagements that nobody writes about but that add up to something larger. Briggs received the medal, said thank you. The next week he went back to construction. Let's zoom out for a moment and put what Briggs did in the context of the campaign as a whole. In the first 72 hours after D-Day, the Allied beachhead was genuinely vulnerable. The forces ashore were not yet strong enough to absorb a full-scale German armored counterattack. The 21st Panzer Division, the only significant German armored formation in the immediate Normandy area, had the potential to hit the beaches before the Allies were consolidated. What slowed the 21st Panzer down? Several things. Confusion in the German command about where exactly the main Allied effort was. Hitler's refusal to release armored reservists without his personal authorization, the disruption to road and rail networks from Allied air power, and the bridges. Destroyed bridges meant forced rerouting. Forced rerouting cost hours that the Allied beachhead used to get stronger. The bridge Briggs targeted was on a secondary route, not the primary axis of any major German formation. But in the chaotic tactical situation of early June 1944, secondary routes mattered. They were the routes that local German commanders used to move their forces when primary routes were blocked. When a secondary route was also blocked, commanders had to go around. Going around cost time. The 3 days that Briggs's second demolition bought, the 72 hours before German engineers could reconstruct that bridge properly, are impossible to quantify in terms of their precise contribution to the overall campaign. But here's what we can say with confidence. Every hour of delay in German movement in the first days after D-Day contributed to Allied consolidation. Every bridge that stayed down was a small part of a larger system that slowed the German response. Briggs's bridge stayed down for 72 hours longer than it would have if he'd only gone once. Briggs went back to construction. Not symbolically. Literally. He went back to the same trade he'd been doing before the war. Concrete, steel, foundations, structures. Over the following decades, he built bridges. Real ones. A career's worth. A colleague who worked with him for many years gave a brief account of what it was like to work alongside Briggs on a structural project. This account has been cited in at least one regimental history. Tom had a habit that I found strange when I first started working with him. Every time we were finishing up the design on a structure, bridge, building, whatever, at the end, he'd ask one question. He'd say, "Right, now, where does this fail?" Not if, where. He'd want to know the point of maximum vulnerability. Which load, which condition, which failure mode would get you first, and only once he had a clear answer to that question would he sign off on the design. The colleague continued. I asked him once why he always ended with that question. He said, "Because the person who knows where a thing breaks is the person who can make sure it never does." The person who knows where a thing breaks is the person who can make sure it never does. That sentence tells you everything about how Briggs thought, about bridges, about demolition, about everything. Thomas Briggs isn't in most histories of Normandy. The battle has its own enormous literature. D-Day itself, Pegasus Bridge, the fighting at Omaha and Utah, the breakout from the Bocage, the encirclement at Falaise. There are entire shelves of books about Normandy. Briggs appears in regimental records, in the citation for his military medal, in a brief mention in a Royal Engineers unit history compiled in the 1970s, in one paragraph in a broader account of Allied demolition operations in Normandy that a military historian published in the 1990s. That's it. His name doesn't appear in the standard narratives. His bridge doesn't have a plaque. The village where it stands hasn't marked it in any way that connects it to what happened in June 1944. This is not unusual. The Normandy campaign involved hundreds of thousands of individual acts of courage and skill that never made it into any record anyone would read. The sappers who cleared mines on the beaches, the signalers who kept communications running under fire, the engineers who built the supply routes that kept the advance moving, the medics who worked in field stations that no one visited after the war was over. Most of what made D-Day work, and Normandy work, was done by people whose names appear in unit logs, if they appear anywhere at all. Briggs is one of those people. We're almost at the end of this one, and I want to ask you something. There's a line from that colleague's account that I can't stop thinking about. The person who knows where a thing breaks is the person who can make sure it never does. Briggs spent the war breaking things, bridges specifically, and he spent his post-war career building things. And in both halves of that life, he was asking the same question. Where does this fail? That question is what made him effective at demolition, and it's what made him effective at construction. The knowledge traveled both ways. I find that genuinely remarkable. Not the bridge, specifically. The mindset. The habit of thinking about failure modes before anything else. Is that a military thing? A Yorkshire thing? A personal characteristic that had nothing to do with either? I don't know. But I think about it every time I hear about someone who's exceptionally good at making something. And I wonder if they started by figuring out how to break it. Drop your thoughts in the comments. This one's genuinely interesting to me. And if you've made it this far, subscribe. Hit the bell. Share this with someone who'd appreciate it. These stories are worth knowing, and your subscription is what makes it possible to keep finding them. Thomas William Briggs died in 1987. He was 67. Yorkshire, his own home. No ceremony, no special announcement. A local obituary that mentioned his service in the war without details. His bridge is still standing. Rebuilt properly after the war, it's been maintained and used for 80 years. The village it connects is still there. The river is still there. There is no sign on that bridge that says anything about June 1944. No marker indicating that this specific structure was destroyed twice in 2 days by one man who planned both operations before the first one started. Nothing to tell the person driving across it that the bridge under their wheels is, in a structural sense, not the bridge that existed in 1944. That what's standing there now is the fourth version of that crossing, rebuilt after the third version was destroyed, which was rebuilt after the second version was destroyed, which was rebuilt after the first version was destroyed. Just a bridge. Briggs went to see it in April 1945, and it was standing, and he laughed. I think I understand why. Not because the bridge being rebuilt was funny, because the bridge being rebuilt was correct, expected, exactly what should happen. You destroy a bridge, someone rebuilds it. That's what bridges are for. That's what engineers do. Briggs knew that going in. He'd planned both his destructions knowing the rebuilds were coming, and he'd built his post-war career on the same understanding. Every structure contains its own failure, and the job is to know that failure so precisely that you can prevent it. He knew where things broke, and that knowledge applied to a bridge in Normandy on 2 consecutive June mornings in 1944. Bought 3 days that the Allied beachhead needed. 3 days that nobody recorded as saved, nobody counted as won. Just a bridge that stayed down a little longer than it would have. That's enough. If this one got to you, hit the like button. Subscribe for more every day. I find the stories that stayed buried in unit records and regimental histories and after-action reports that almost nobody has read. Ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. And share this with someone who thinks they know the full story of D-Day, because we're just getting started.